I just wanted to add something local to what you were talking about, Colorado and Washington. You know, that the ACLU and Peter Lewis's folks betrayed us on our initiative here. We had it already written in the legislature with more than a dozen co-sponsors for 24 plants per patient. And the ACLU and Peter Lewis's folks, including the petition that's here to sign today, takes away that right. They gutted what we had worked on for over a year. And
Norman, you know that's not true. You know that's not true.
Well, I'm sorry, that is true. We had worked on it for over a year. We had more than a dozen co-sponsors.
Here's a prime example of such, in that we have, individuals who I presume both want marijuana legalized, and yet here in Massachusetts, there's a clear and obvious dissension between organizers at the grassroots level who want to grow their own cannabis because they either don't trust corporations, don't want to pay taxes, and want quality control. Or just someone like myself, you're just New England frugal. You want to be able to grow your own. Why should I have to go buy something that I can grow my own? So, without getting into the middle of this dispute here, there's no doubt, that's unquestioned, that the thing that is what we're all being asked if you're a registered voter in Massachusetts to sign is not what the grassroots wanted. That's not in dispute. It should not be.
Actually, it is.
I would absolutely
and a member of the
entertain this
organization
discussion.
that, as a patient,
Yes.
and a member of the organization
Yes.
that got asked to be on the steering committee that you
Yes.
were talking about, where people are coming in from outside with
Right.
the money and whatever. A
All
dozen
true.
of us sat down. We
Right.
hammered out the things. Now, it wasn't perfect, but there was a lot of things like the grow your own norm, which I know you're worried about,
Right.
that actually are in there because we were there. Because the original proposition that they had thrown at us before it got vetted by us was substantially different than what we looked at the end of the day.
No,
After
it's
the
not for
seventh
every
draft.
patient
Norm,
to go their own. It's
Norm.
not. You're not telling the truth. It's not for every patient to go their own.
So what it is, but basically, because you're getting into these details, it's because the stakeholders, and when I mean stakeholders, for example, you came to this effort when? When were you first involved in this as a
I've been a member of NORML for
patient?
15 years. I've been a patient for 5.
I mean, you've been an active and publicly outed and involved for how long?
5 years.
Okay. Well, you know that these things go back long before your involvement in this.
Yes. But
In
order for it to be constructive, we can't be tied up with what happened. We're talking about what's happening.
That's right. And the difficulty is when individuals come from out of state and purport to represent. Now, think of it like this. If I changed this dynamic and said, what if a billionaire came to Massachusetts and put up an initiative to make abortion not only criminal, but you would get murder penalties? How many people would feel good about a billionaire coming here and basically trying to get you to change your laws that you yourselves didn't even organize to actually change? This is the quandary that we are up against in the grassroots. And so, again, blessed is Peter Lewis and George Soros and John Sperling, who is the president of Phoenix University, and about 10 other funders who have brought us to this point. Along that way, they have pissed away, in my view, between $20 and $40 million, and they have made reform take far longer than it would have had to take it had there been that kind of obvious amalgam between the money and the grassroots. So it is a long, ongoing dispute that we even find right here in this auditorium, here in Massachusetts. I would surely say, though, as somebody, as I will find myself doing as I always do, if there is something on the initiative, on the ballot, and you can pull a lever or push a button, and it generally reforms the laws, you absolutely are morally bound to change those laws as best you can. You must do it. Regrettably, there will be those of us who have to come in on the backside and mediate the disputes, litigate the cases at the trial level, the appellate level, And sometimes it takes years to try to fix the problems of our own solutions. But I think most of this is rooted, and I just hone in on this one point before opening up more questions, because questions are fun, is that it's a bizarre concept to see the biggest funders and the biggest institutional supporters for reform not be able to actually embrace the very people that they purport to represent. Or they just handpick the group that they feel the most comfortable around, which generally speaking isn't representing the grassroots. And believe me, you're talking to somebody who's gone to rainbow festivals. You know, I've done it all, right? And I can assure you, our rainbow is a huge one, and we need everybody involved in it. So it's been unfortunate, in my view, that the big Uber money comes into this, and they almost always, one of the first things they do is split the grassroots right off, and leave the grassroots, and it's almost what I call Clinton-Tonian math. They realize, you know what? They don't need us, and in many cases will triangulate against us. We don't want to. I mean, normal has probably been used as much to pass laws as it's been used to block laws, because of people not wanting to be associated with something like legalization. So it's vexing, and it's right here in Massachusetts. But again, if it gets on the ballot, please, it should be a given. Vote for the reform. And then any warts, any problems can be resolved in legislation later. I'm a bigger fan, frankly, of legislation than I am of the initiative process. And so that's what happens in most of the other states. We usually go back some years later through legislation and try to fix the problems to the extent there are some. Yeah, what you got?
You spoke of Washington and Colorado. What do you think is going to happen in California? I think there's different groups with different proposals out there.
Yes, thank you. The question is a very good one. California was quite united 2 years ago behind this one Proposition 19. Now, I think if I'm not incorrect, there are 4 competing ones in California, all by reformers, all of whom I know and love. Ironically, I've signed here. They all come and say, hey, will you sign the initiative? I'll say, sure. And then the guy calls up with me and says, hey, I saw you sign the other initiative. I said, I sign every effing initiative. One, I'm not a California resident, so it really doesn't matter. But I support all reform. Normal supports all reforms. Yes, we'd like to see, quote, more perfect reform, but so California is a real mess. I think the fact that there are 4 to maybe 5 competing initiatives has made it so that the big money is definitely sitting on the side. They don't want to get involved in this at all, and the numbers are not polling well in California. Remember I mentioned earlier, you really want to see the magic number is actually 58.5%. You want to see that for 6 months in a row. We're not polling that high in California for the legalization topic right now. It's basically between 53 and 54%. The other thing that I'll share with you, which is a big strategic quandary, I have to give a speech in Los Angeles next week at a plenary section of the Drug Policy Alliance, which is the biggest pro-drug reform conference in the world. And it's a wonderful community building event. And because we're privy to the data and the focus groups, $100,000 was spent after Prop 19 failed by 3 percentage points. We wanted to find out, obviously, why did it fail? How did it fail? What strategy would be used in the future to do a better job? So something came out of that makes my toes curl every time I think about it. And if this is the case in California, this is really going to be why it's going to take decades to move the Midwest and the Southeast United States. And that is that even in California, where marijuana has been vetted and talked about and voted on and celebrated and legally sold, if you will, more than any place on earth, for 30 years, Californians have been debating and talking about marijuana in one form or another, more than any other state. And yet there, 49% of Californians, when asked, say they fear marijuana more than they do alcohol. Now, that is, of course, completely and utterly illogical, and when I debate, and see these things on the internet if you want to see me turn very red, and debate folks mainly from the DEA, and so I almost always, in my rhetorical rants with them, I will often reach under the lectern and I'll pull up a bottle of liquor, anything over 80 proof, like a quart of it, and I'll put it on their lectern, and then I'll invite them to drink 10, 15, or if they can finish the whole bottle, go ahead. And everybody in the audience, and of course my debating opponent, knows what the outcome is going to be. They're going to either be in a coma or they're going to be dead. And my counter challenge to that is I will smoke every nanogram of marijuana in the city I happen to be in. And everybody pretty much acknowledges, including my debating partner, what will happen to me? I'll have very dry mouth, I'll have very red eyes, I'll definitely have increased appetite. I might be a little sleepy in about an hour and a half or two after the impairment. But you know what's going to happen the next morning? I'm going to get up and I can do it all over again. And having been a judge at the Cannabis Cup Awards, you can actually get up and do it again, despite being exposed to prodigious amounts of cannabis, or hash oils, or if anybody ever offers you earwax, just say yes. I'll leave you to figure that out. But it's remarkable where the politics of this is going, the industry of medical marijuana, and at the same time, we're just not moving as fast as any of us wants to do. I mean, the great dream at Normal is to call the landlord, say, take your lease, ram it up your butt, take the keys, ram them through the mail slot, and walk away from it. That is the dream. We don't want to be in business. Yes, there'll be some other retail, wholesale thing that'll be there, like a trade association. I'm out. I'll be long gone as Normal morphs from being a pro-advocacy group to one that would actually front for either retail concerns or wholesale concerns. And I can promise you, in Washington, D.C., as in every state capital and every capital on earth, there are two entities that come at you. Either the retail side of economics or the wholesale side. You think they have the same concerns? They generally do, but when it comes to taxation, regulation, and control, they can both literally be at each other's throats. And so in Washington, D.C., every day I pick up the rags and I read about how the American Distilleries Council, which is the lobby group for hard liquor, is in a pissing match, if you will, with the beer lobby. Because in this case, the beer lobby was trying to get out of paying taxes and kind of pushing it on to the hard booze people. And the hard booze people are trying to push it. Again, it's just all about money, which is okay in a capitalist society. That should be okay. But so it's just fascinating to see where this is all going. And I think California, so to put a coda on my point here, I think that if Washington State, if those entities can gel together, and in Colorado, they have a better chance to get the big money to pass this. And the other thing, too, is California, oh, is it expensive to do anything in California. You have 14 separate media markets that you have to spend money in. In a place like Colorado, you spend money in Denver. That's it. If you're doing something in Washington, you spend money in Seattle and a couple of other cities like Spokane, and that's it. California is a city, a state nation. It would have the 5th largest economy in the world between France and Italy. It's that big. And I say that as someone who used to think of driving from Cape Cod, where I grew up, to here as the longest journey in the world. That 3 hours, now I do that as a commute in DC to get from point A to point B. Questions, concerns? Yeah.
What's your strategy or normal strategy for dealing with the conflict between federal law and state laws where there's been decriminalization or legalization of marijuana as medicine?
Jack alluded to this too in a question, and Up until this last week, where the California Medical Association favored legalization and the Gallup poll finally hit 50%, up until those two things came together, I would have told you that the prior 2 weeks before that were the worst 2 weeks that the marijuana law reform movement had probably had in 20 years. If I can remember off the top of my head what happened within a 2-week period, so that we understand what we're talking about here between federal and state governments. The federal government does not, the Controlled Substances Act does not allow marijuana under any circumstances, whether you're an industrial farmer, whether you're a patient, whether you want to use it for recreational purposes. No ifs, ands, or buts. We've gone to the Supreme Court twice, in 2002 and 2005, and lost handily both times. So, the case law is totally against us, the statutory law is totally against us. But we live in the United States. And the states are the democracies, the laboratories of democracies, we're told. So, as indicated, in 1996, Californians voted for medical marijuana, and it started this process of now all these different states have decrim and medical marijuana laws. What the feds did about 2 weeks ago, they started to, one, the best of breed medical marijuana dispensary, one could argue, is the Harborside Health Center in Oakland, California. And they are very, very astute business people that run it. And for years, they've been running it like a business. They're lawyers, and everybody is telling them, you pay taxes, you pay these things. So they've been deducting their federal taxes and taking the deductions off their taxes. And the IRS came to them about a year ago and said, you can't deduct your federal taxes for something that's illegal, which obviously kind of makes sense. So basically, they got what's called a 520E ruling against them, basically saying that you can't deduct your taxes, and they got hit with a very big tax penalty and lien. And frankly speaking, the next day, when this happened, my phone lit up white hot with probably 2,000 of those 2,400 dispensaries calling normal, because the pall that that put over the industry, I mean, they don't know whether they're legitimate business people anymore. That same week, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and some other acronymed bureaucracy in Washington went into the banks in the Front Range of California, of Denver, Colorado, and they basically froze the bank accounts of a number of these dispensaries, saying you can't deposit $10,000 a day of medical marijuana money here. That same week, the ATF put out a one-page memo in a way that, again, perfect black letter of the law, but completely, utterly frustrating. If you have an FID card, when you fill it out, and at any time you can be asked when you purchase ammunition or a gun, one of the things that you have to agree to is that you're not an addict or you're not an alcoholic. And in this, you basically, there's two parts of the question. You acknowledge you're not under the influence or an addict of a drug, whether it's alcohol, something legal, or something illegal, or that you use controlled substances under the Controlled Substances Act. Okay. Well, there are approximately 900,000 to 1.3 million card-carrying registered medical marijuana patients in the United States. They have a state-issued ID. So they walk into the gun store and they say, hey, I want to get a gun for whatever reason, or it's deer season or duck season, they want to buy a firearm. And they, surely under the Second Amendment, one presumes they can do so, considering how sacrosanct the Second Amendment is generally treated. So they walk in, and gun dealer, in this one particular case we represented, gun dealer said, wow, aren't you involved with some medical marijuana dispensary in this area? Yeah. So you use marijuana? I think, no, I'm a medical patient. He says, well, I can't sell you a gun because you're violating the Controlled Substances Act. He goes, wait a minute, I have a license from the state to smoke marijuana. I have a doctor's recommendation to do so. Gun dealer said, listen, I'm not going to lose my federal license and face a multi-$100,000 fine to sell you a gun if I can't legally do so. And that set off about a 2-year effort behind the scenes where we were trying to negotiate with the ATF to basically come up with a ruling that says, in effect, if you're a state-compliant patient, of course you still have your Second Amendment rights, right? You can use Percocet, you can use OxyContin, you can use all these other drugs if you're not an addict of them, and you have them prescribed to you legally. And unfortunately, the ATF, because of the laws such as they are in prohibition, basically said no. And so right now I can tell you, if you're a medical marijuana patient in any one of these 15 states, you don't possess your Second Amendment right. The other thing that happened that week, as if this wasn't enough, was letters went out to landlords of those who rent to these medical dispensaries saying to them, hey, have you ever read something called the RAVE Act?